Just want to let you guys know before this video starts that the step back tweed jacket went missing in the move, and we'll have to get a new one, but let's just have a moment of silence. I mean, not you, not me, I'm just gonna keep talking. Have 25 or so minutes of silence for the step back jacket, and do a memorial, like, share, and subscribe. I recently moved out of the city and wanted to give you all a little taste of the green majesty of London, Ontario, the forest city. Now, you're probably confused, thinking, why is he talking about some mid-sized Canadian city in a video about Puerto Rico? But I have a little bit of a point besides just having an excuse to film outside. This land, with its very British name, was at one point French territory that the British took during the 7 Years' War. Territory the French in turn took from the Attawandaronk, who had been driven out by the Anishinaabe during the Beaver Wars. There's actually like a museum just up the road that has artifacts left behind from pre-Columbian times. Virtually every part of Turtle Island or North America to settlers has layers of peoples, colonization, and lives on top of that. The Caribbean is very similar. I've gotten several requests to talk about the beautiful archipelago Puerto Rico. It holds a unique position in America's strange network of extraterritorial colonies. We're going to unpack the island's history layer by layer, like cutting into Puerto Rico like it's some kind of cake.
What is he doing?
Oh, no. This did not happen.
Oh, no.
He's already dead.
The history of Puerto Rico is a great story of resilient peoples, diverse cultural mixing, which you know I'm a fan of, and strange American politics and imperialism that has led us to the situation we have today. And as we explore this layered history, think about the place you live and the layers your society is built upon. So let's talk about Puerto Rico, preferably inside because I'm already getting sweaty. Puerto Rico was one of the first places in the Americas to be colonized by Europeans, starting in the late 15th century. Still, its pre-Columbian history shows quite an undertold story of indigenous life in the Caribbean going back millennia. The first human feet upon the island, which would become Puerto Rico, were likely about 4,000 years ago. Today, we call the owners of those first feet the Ortoitoid people. This is around the same time the ancestors of the Latins arrived in Italy, the completion of Stonehenge, and the extinction of the woolly mammoths. So, you know, a long-ass time ago. Archaeologists believe these people migrated from modern-day Venezuela, specifically the Orinoco River Valley. Beginning sometime around 5000 BCE, we see their settlement into the Caribbean beginning in Trinidad. This was still during the Ice Age, so they likely walked over, as Trinidad was still connected to South America by a land bridge. According to the stuff left behind by these people, they seem to be foraging societies, lived in caves, made stone and bone tools, and dined primarily off of shellfish. The next wave of migrants to Puerto Rico that came and interacted with, as well as partially displaced the Ortoitoid, were the Saladoid. Archaeologists have a much easier time studying these people because they were farmers and created settlements and pottery. Archaeologists love their pottery. The make of them in design, technique, and substance shows a lot about the culture of the society which produced it. The prevailing narrative is that the Saladoid simply displaced the Ortoitoid people and left no real impact on them as they did so. But this understanding seems to be changing. In archaeologist Reniel Ramos' book, Rethinking Puerto Rican Precolonial History, the author looks deeper into this subject, challenging colonial simplifications of events. He explores the colonial mindset in the assumption that one group simply overtook the other, which turns out to be simplistic and doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It's worth a read, definitely, if you want to chew into a potentially massive disruption of pre-Columbian Puerto Rican history. Keep in mind that what we know about the past is just our best idea at the time and subject to significant revisions, just like any other field of study. Not sure why when scientists do this it's okay, but when historians do it or archaeologists do it, I get torrents of angry comments. And so it's okay. It's good even to revise your beliefs when confronted with new evidence. These people spoke a language family known as Arawak, directly related to South America linguistically. Today, our words for barbecue, hammock, canoe, tobacco, and hurricane come from their language. As Arawak-speaking people, known as Taino people, settled Puerto Rico, they split into subcultures, which we know because of a detailed study of ceramics. More pottery. Always more pottery. However, as thousands of years passed, the inhabitants of the Caribbean developed their own culture distinct from their South American progenitors. Arawak culture, though with plenty of local variation, was the one with the pleasure of being the first Native Americans to meet with Europeans. It's like saying they were the first dinosaurs to meet the asteroid. This society had classes of commoners and nobles. The chiefs, known as caciques, ruled over multiple villages with the help of healers and spiritual leaders known as boiques. While by and large these titles were held by men, they passed down matrilinearly. Their society farmed and hunted and gathered and even played sports with rubber balls, which were not introduced to Europeans until after the Columbian exchange. As for food, they enjoyed a wide variety of fruits, vegetables, and meats. Like many pre-Columbian Native Americans, they ate a much healthier diet than Europeans, with much more variety. This is why they weren't stunted and weak. Their culture was also quite unique. They worshipped ancestral spirits known as zemis, with chief deities as well as smaller ones for everyday life. Also, women and their children lived separately from men, which gave women much more autonomy over their lives and bodies. This culture thrived for centuries, but then white people came. I decided to record this snippet here because it's probably going to be universally applicable in a lot of future videos. So for anyone who doesn't know better, Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic Ocean with a Spanish flag, causing one of the most extensive mass deaths in human history, to the tune of about 1 in 5 human beings. The first Europeans to arrive in Puerto Rico were members of Christopher Columbus's second voyage in 1493. In true European tradition, they landed, gave it a name no one on the island ever called it, and claimed it as their own, despite, the first colonial leader was Juan Ponce de Leon, a lieutenant under Columbus. The Spanish crown made him governor because of his excellent service on the island of Hispaniola. Ponce de Leon set up a colony by the name of Caparra in 1508. His job was to procure 2 things for sweet old Spanish Queen Isabella. Number 1, gold, and number 2, slaves. The Spanish quickly developed 2 colonies and used it as the staging ground for de Leon's expedition, which discovered Florida. They brought all the invasive species and deadly infections they could to Puerto Rico and began to set up shop. This is over a century before the Mayflower. Spanish colonists set up a sort of slave feudal system called encomienda to enslave the entire population of the island and force them to work for the Spanish. Between brutal repression, disease, and being worked to death, nearly the whole population and any semblance of indigenous culture was destroyed. It was a pleasant little surprise to find out recently through genetic testing that many Puerto Ricans have some Taino DNA. Up until then, historians suspected the Taino had been completely wiped out. Despite the small Taino minority who insisted they were not extinct. As many as 70,000 people were living on the island when colonization began, and before long, it was widely believed they had been completely eradicated. Just let that sink in a little. As the indigenous population began to dwindle, the Spanish began to import slaves from Africa. This story just keeps getting better and better. For the next 3 centuries, Puerto Rico stood as one of the Spanish Empire's colonial holdings. It was always under threat by other European powers who wanted some of that sweet stolen merch. The French made an unsuccessful attempt to take it in the 1520s, 30s, and 50s. In 1595, English privateer Sir Francis Drake tried to take a bite of it. I just want to note that when I was in the Dominican for my honeymoon, every tour guide insisted on referring to him as a pirate. Still, I don't feel he's cool enough to be a pirate, and privateers are the robbing the high seas versions of motorcycle gangs with Blue Lives Matter patches on their jackets. They do cool pirate stuff, but in service of the state. Ugh. Drake tried to take Puerto Rico's capital of San Juan, but the Spanish had built mighty forts that kept him out. 3 years later, though, the Spanish landed on the beach and held the island for a few months until they were defeated by the most potent weapon of all, dysentery. The Dutch attempted to take the island in 1625 with little success, and it was briefly a battleground of the war between France and Spain and the United Kingdom in this mess Napoleon created in the 19th century. Speaking of Napoleon, his conquests had quite the impact on Puerto Rico and all of Latin America, really. France conquered Spain in 1809, and as part of the revolutionary government shakeup, gave Puerto Ricans a form of citizenship rights. In 1815, mercantilism ended, and so Puerto Rico could both receive immigrants from other nations' colonies and trade with them. Puerto Rico was loaded with cash crops like coffee, tobacco, and sugar, all the Caribbean treats. So they stood to make a hell of a lot of dollars, or I guess in this place, ducats? Pesos? Apparently it's gold, escudos, and reals. Yeah, old money was a real ass, eh? Offers of free land resulted in a wave of European immigrants to Puerto Rico, and the open economy increased the island's economic power. But as the Napoleonic period came to an end, Puerto Rico lost much of that power and autonomy and became a colony once again as the restored British monarchy tried to consolidate their power. But not everything went right back to normal. Slavery ended in 1835, and the new governor started building institutions like schools to develop the island. The snag, though, like most of Latin America, was that whiplash of gaining independence and having it taken away again. The next few decades brought some political instability. Those schools set up by the Spanish were lousy. The island had poor infrastructure, and Spain was a decaying, overbearing colonial master, which by the 19th century was a ghost of its former self. Anyone seeking to change conditions on the island would also be arrested or exiled. Working-class Puerto Ricans revolted in 1868. They were trying to throw off the Spanish oppression and declare Puerto Rican independence. It was called the Lares Uprising, based on the town where it started, and was led by Dr. Ramon Emeterio Bentances, a physician in exile in the Dominican. The revolt was big, but the Spanish quickly put it down. However, it was a sign the island was beginning to crack. The late 19th century brought reforms, the leadership of Puerto Rico freed the last of the slaves, and a political debate began to bubble to the surface. Should Puerto Rico try to strengthen its ties with Spain and integrate as part of Spain and their government? Or should Puerto Rico become more independent and autonomous? Sounds actually kind of like a familiar debate, doesn't it? Meanwhile, many of the leaders of the Lares Uprising were in exile in New York City. They attempted to organize another rebellion in 1897. While it was not totally successful, Spain did give Puerto Rico a charter of autonomy which allowed the island to manage its own affairs. It was autonomy, but not independence. They still maintained a colonial governor alongside their elected prime minister. It was looking pretty good, but then, well, America. Those Puerto Rican revolutionaries in New York put in significant work in the 1890s to butter up to influential American leaders. Part of US geopolitical goals in the late 19th century included securing their sphere of influence, the same way as the British were, by building a off-sized navy and exerting it abroad, especially in places they thought they were in charge, such as the Caribbean. As such, they long had plans to go to war with Spain to take those sweet, sweet Caribbean colonies. By 1898, it looked like this war was going to happen, with the flashpoint happening in Cuba. Puerto Rican revolutionaries tried to work their way into these discussions to put their country on the map as a target during the war with Cuba. By April of 1898, they would get their wish. Dishonest journalism, political aims, and a capitalized on disaster led the United States to declare war on Spain, starting a short but important war cleverly titled the Spanish-American War. This was a pretty fast and one-sided conflict. The US easily won, and with it, they took their intended targets. Spain capitulated, and in the Treaty of Paris, Cuba became independent, and the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico would become dependents of the United States of America. And today, over a century later, Puerto Rico is pretty much in the same boat, or it's still a dependent of the United States. SKILLSHARE, learning community. Millions come together as one to learn about subjects such as illustration, design, photography, and freelancing. SKILLSHARE, for less than $10 a month. Master the art of film, or whatever you want to know about. SKILLSHARE, sate one's curiosity with this class on humor by Matt Bellassai. With his wisdom, you too might learn how to properly sell SKILLSHARE without losing retention. SKILLSHARE. The next 1,000 people who use the link in the description receive 2 free months of the service. Get it before the sands of time erase this deal for all time. SKILLSHARE. So yeah, Puerto Rico was part of America now. Yay! Right after the transfer of power, the island's leadership went to US General John R. Brooke, who led sweeping changes. They adopted the American dollar, put in a real education system, which only taught lessons in English, and a postal system. They even built infrastructure and created a health service, and even temporarily renamed the island to the strangely anglicized Puerto Rico. The gods blessed this exchange of power by blasting the island with crippling hurricanes the following year, killing thousands and wrecking the island's infrastructure, all that shiny new stuff that just got built with the flooding. In the devastation of the island, one key event took place, which became a significant part of the Puerto Rican story. 5,000 workers left the island to work on sugar plantations in Hawaii. We'll talk a little bit about this more later, but a big part of the Puerto Rican story is a mass diaspora, with accompanying cycles of leaving and returning. Puerto Rico became a cash crop haven. All those Puerto Rican treats, sugar, tobacco, coffee, they were all the source of big bucks for a small, wealthy elite. Yeah, this is America. What were you thinking it was going to be? But out of those treats they produced, only one would come out to be the real king. The US was already the king of tobacco, still is by the way, and so cheap cigarettes in America made the Puerto Rican tobacco industry less competitive. Coffee growers did all right, but they found themselves outcompeted for sweet, sweet farmland by a massive bump in the output of sugar. The first major US capital investment in Puerto Rico was to build up its sugar production industry. Puerto Rico was one of the few places an American company could produce sugar without having to pay import tariffs to get it back into the country. It's basically just Puerto Rico and Hawaii at this point. In 1899, the military handed the island back to the people with the passing of the Foraker Act. This act allowed the US president to appoint a governor, it formed a small legislature, and instituted an executive council. US President McKinley, who we'll talk a little bit more on this channel in our next video, appointed all the people he needed to, including the first governor, Charles Herbert Allen. The act was later amended to replace the government with a presidentially appointed supervisory council. You'll notice the government's changing quite a bit. Under Woodrow Wilson's government, there were some reappointments to put the council under majority Puerto Rican control for the first time since it joined the United States. But all in all, this act took a lot of autonomy from Puerto Rican people and gave it directly to the US president. Discussions over Puerto Rico's place in the US continued and resulted in the Jones Act, which brought a significant change in policy yet again. The Jones Act gave all Puerto Ricans American citizenship. The Union Party, a political party focused on making Puerto Rico independent, opposed this move without also giving Puerto Rico US statehood. They saw it as just a way to block independence movements. Puerto Ricans had the right to be drafted into the military, but not vote. Funny you should mention that to me because this all happened in 1917. Just enough time for thousands of Puerto Ricans to be drafted into the First World War. The Jones Act also gave Puerto Rico a little American-style government with senators, a House of Representatives, and elections. However, the US could veto any laws that this government passed, and the president appointed many of the key heads of major government departments. In 1948, President Truman even gave them the right to vote for their own governor. How generous. Again, the question about what Puerto Ricans wanted wasn't addressed. The political debate on the ground was over whether to continue a process toward statehood or seek independence. Government cracked down on independence protests, including one nasty incident in 1935 known as the Rio Piedras Massacre, and the shooting of a peaceful parade known as the Ponce Massacre in 1937. In 1948, a bill known as the Gag Law made singing Puerto Rican patriotic songs and flying any flag but the American flag a crime. Yay, freedom of speech. In 1950, Puerto Rican nationalists staged several revolts and uprisings against the governor, prompting the president to send in the US military to shut it down. Nationalists even tried to assassinate President Truman himself and fired upon the US House of Representatives from the viewing gallery. It was an intense time. After World War II, the combination of military recruitment and the Great Depression led to a mass exodus of Puerto Ricans from the island. Primarily, they migrated to New York City, where there's still a large community today. In 1950, Congress in DC passed a new law allowing the Puerto Ricans to remake their government yet again. That's like 3 times in the last 50 years. What I love is the Puerto Ricans took the Spanish name for the state as the Estado Libre Asociado de Puerto Rico. However, because Uncle Sam really didn't like that term, the Free Associated State of Puerto Rico, they thought it sounded a bit too much like they were a state. The English version of the name is the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. The Spanish version remains unchanged. They were even granted the ability to be independent in 1946, but the leader, Jesus Piñero, was told by Washington to not pursue it, making everybody angry. Piñero's crackdowns on dissidents and the gag law prompted some needs for yet another big change. In 1967, there was a referendum on not independence, but statehood for Puerto Rico. Statehood lost to staying a commonwealth by a margin of about 60-40. It was large enough to do nothing, but also kept the debate alive. Further attempts at statehood in 1993 and 1998 also failed, but one in 2012 did succeed. However, there was some sketchiness behind it where many Puerto Ricans were convinced to not vote. The results were largely disregarded as a result. The statehood of Puerto Rico remains a point of political debate today, and the vast majority of Puerto Ricans sway between wanting to stay a commonwealth and become a state, with independence mostly off the table at this point. If you're confused as to where Puerto Rico stands legally, you're not alone. Various administrations and governments have tried to redefine it so many times, it's an utter mess. A mess which costs lives. Jurisdictional debates are rampant in the management of Puerto Rico, and it's just separate enough that many presidents and Congresses flat out ignore it. Washington is uninterested in admitting a new state of 3 million people with a much higher rate of poverty than the incorporated states. The American right is also a little scared of accepting a new state with a higher population than 42% of current US states, which has a sizable non-white population and primarily speaks Spanish. Democrats would have a lot to gain from admitting a state that would likely give them many more seats in the House, 2 more senators, and shift the Electoral College in their favor, but that would involve having to do something, and the Democrats are more into like tearing up papers while voting for everything that Trump wants, so they're not really much in the favor of doing things. So in a mess with few economic prospects, a large number of Puerto Ricans go to the US mainland to work and pay remittances to their families back home. They've settled in many places, setting up ethnic enclaves around America, but as we've talked about, especially in New York. And this exodus hasn't been helped by a massive debt crisis in 2017 brought about by an arcane law preventing Puerto Rico from borrowing and paying off debts in the same way as a normal US state could. To rub salt in the wound, you might also remember Hurricane Maria devastated the island in 2018. The lack of response by President Trump, who we're not super sure even knew Puerto Rico was part of his jurisdiction, caused the water to become contaminated due to destroyed infrastructure. As climate change gets worse, Puerto Rico is up for even more deadly hurricanes in the future. The lack of investment in recovery has been crippling. So with all that, what's to be done? Will there ever be a settled position for this island? Will its people ever be genuinely independent, or even have a say in the country they nominally belong to? At this moment, Puerto Ricans are being criminally neglected by their colonial master. And if America is going to just be cool with having colonies in the year of our Ford 2020, they need to do a lot more listening. They'll also have to do one thing they've historically been terrible at: face a problem head on and not kick the can down the road. Oh, and involve the people affected by a policy in the decisions on said policy. Imperialism is bad. Can't wait to see the Brain Force Plus geniuses agree with me on that point. But this strange relationship with Puerto Rico is like a hangnail on the weird world of America's colonial empire. And people are suffering as a result. So let's just join in and say, do something! Thanks to everyone who signed up for Skillshare to help keep this channel running, as well as my awesome patrons. They saw this video early and without the sponsor break for as little as $1 a month. Patrons can even get a free month of Means TV, the leftist video co-op, as a way for me to say thank you. So, if you want to help keep the rent paid and the cats fed, go to patreon.com/stepbackhistory. Peace.